I'm not lying." Lark Winthrop's voice cracked across the wind-swept plain, carrying farther than she wanted. The dusk hung heavy, the sun sinking behind jagged mesas, streaking the sky with fire orange and bruised purple. Her apron was torn, streaked with dirt and blood, and her hands trembled as she approached the campfire where the Apache warrior knelt, his broad back silhouetted against the dying light. Sparks drifted upward like tiny stars, swirling around Kaelen's bare, tanned shoulders, and the sound of the fire crackling mingled with the distant howl of a lone coyote. "They beat me." "For serving you," she repeated, voice breaking again. Her knees almost gave out. She wasn't used to pleading, never had been, but the fear that had rooted itself in her chest the moment she'd stepped foot outside her homestead now clawed at her throat. Kaelen didn't move. He didn't blink. Only the glint of his knife under the firelight betrayed a hint of motion. Lark had always known this day might come. She had grown up on the outskirts of Red Mesa, where settlers and Apache lived in a delicate, uneasy balance. Yet she had never felt the full weight of that tension until she carried water and bread to this camp, daring to cross lines that most women in her town would not even think of approaching. And now, having been caught and beaten for it, she stood here, exposed and terrified, hoping that the fear in her voice would reach him. Kaelen finally straightened. His dark eyes, deep as a canyon shadow, lifted to hers. They were the eyes of a man who had seen too much loss and too much cruelty, yet they held a clarity that could freeze a heart in its tracks. The firelight flickered over his sharp cheekbones, the intricate beads and feathers woven into his hair clinking faintly as he moved. His presence was enormous, a mixture of grace and raw power, and it pressed down on Lark as she tried to straighten her back. "Why?" he asked, voice low, measured, dangerous. It was not a question she had expected, and yet it demanded an answer. Lark swallowed, tasting the metallic tang of blood in her mouth. She lifted a trembling hand, pointing toward the distant homestead, where the faint outlines of broken fence posts and a sagging roof could just be made out against the dusk. They said if I brought you food, if I helped you, they'd hurt my family," she admitted. The words were barely audible over the wind. I couldn't just let you starve." Kaelen's gaze softened, not completely, but just enough that she felt a flicker of relief. Relief that maybe he would understand. Relief that maybe she hadn't crossed a line that couldn't be undone. She lowered herself to the ground, pulling her knees to her chest, shivering as the cold desert night crept over the mesa. Dust clung to her skin, coarse and scratchy, and the scent of smoke and sage from the fire mingled with the bitter tang of fear. Lark's heart hammered in her chest. Each beat a deafening reminder that she had risked everything for a man she barely knew, a man whose people and her people had long histories of distrust and violence. The silence stretched for a long moment, broken only by the whispering wind and the occasional snap of a burning ember. Then Kaelen spoke, his voice barely above the crackling fire, yet each word struck her like a hammer. "You are brave, foolish, but brave." Lark's eyes widened. She had expected anger, perhaps revenge, maybe even dismissal, not acknowledgement. And yet the weight of his gaze pressed down, testing her, measuring her courage against the cruelty she had endured. I didn't have a choice," she whispered, almost to herself. "I couldn't let them hurt my family. Not again. I've seen what they do." Her voice broke entirely, and she lowered her gaze to the ground, ashamed and frightened. Kaelen rose, his movements fluid, almost predatory, yet careful. He extended a hand, not in aggression, but in a strange, unspoken offer of protection. "You've already paid too high a price for your choice," he said. His eyes softened, and for the first time, Lark allowed herself to hope. Hope that maybe she wasn't entirely alone on this harsh, unforgiving land. The desert wind blew harder. sweeping gust around them, carrying the smell of sage and smoke, of blood and sweat, of fear and courage intertwined. And in that moment, amidst the fading light and roaring silence, Lark Winthrop realized that the night had only just begun and that whatever came next, she and Kaelen would face it together. The wind whipped across the mesa, carrying dust that stung Lark Winthrop's eyes and scraped against her arms. Kaelen stood silently, the fading orange light of sunset casting long shadows across his bare, muscular torso. His long black hair tumbled over his shoulders, catching glints from the firelight, and the beads and feathers in his hair clinked faintly with each subtle movement. Lark's heart pounded as she stepped closer, the ache in her limbs from the day's bruises and fear threatening to topple her. "Why?" Kaelen asked again, his voice low, dangerous, yet strangely calm. It was the same question he had asked at the fire, but now it carried weight, the kind that could decide life or death. Lark swallowed, her throat dry and raw, and lifted her gaze to meet his dark, penetrating eyes. She started, but her words faltered. She shook, the wind tugging at her skirts and hair. They said, they'd hurt my family if I helped outsiders. If I gave food, or water, or even a message. Her voice cracked, tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. I couldn't just let them die. Not you. Not anyone. Kaelen's eyes narrowed, scanning her, measuring every tremor in her hands, every line of fear etched across her face. Lark had expected rage, a shout, a swing of his knife. Instead, he remained still, silent, the firelight flickering across the sharp lines of his jaw and the scars etched into his chest, and arms a map of battles fought and survived. You risked everything for them. And for me, Kaelen said finally, his voice a low rumble like distant thunder over the mesa. Why? Lark shivered. Because it's not right, she whispered. I've seen what they do to anyone who steps out of line. I felt it myself, and I couldn't let them hurt someone who didn't deserve it. The wind picked up again, dust swirling around them, ghost-like in the firelight. Sparks rose, drifting over Kaelen's shoulders, tracing the lines of his strong back and the intricate jewelry that clinked faintly. Lark wrapped her arms around herself, shivering not from cold, but from the raw intensity of the man standing before her. He was enormous, terrifying, and yet she felt a strange safety in his presence, as if the desert itself had chosen him to guard her. Kaelen's lips pressed into a thin line. He moved closer, each step deliberate, controlled, and the ground seemed to tremble beneath his weight. You've been beaten for your choice, he said, voice quiet but sharp. And yet you come here, again, with nothing but courage. And fear. His eyes softened for just a moment. You are unusual, Lark Winthrop. Lark flinched at the sound of her name on his lips. She had never heard it spoken with respect, only with dismissal or contempt from her neighbors. Her chest rose and fell rapidly, the ache in her bruised ribs reminding her that she was far from invincible. Yet somehow, hearing him say it, it grounded her. She started, but Kaelen raised a hand. No words, he said. Actions speak louder than threats. And you have proven yourself even before understanding what it means to stand before me. For a moment, the wind paused, the mesa eerily still, as if the desert itself held its breath. Lark felt her fear and awe collide, a mixture that made her pulse race. The coyote howled again in the distance, a lonely note that reminded her of the vast, wild world beyond the tiny fire. Kaelen's presence was both a shield and a challenge, a living reminder that the frontier demanded respect and that her small acts of bravery mattered more than she had realized. Then Kaelen turned, scanning the horizon. Lark followed his gaze, seeing the faint movement of settlers and the distant figures on horseback, perhaps returning or perhaps just passing. The knowledge that danger lingered beyond the mesa only sharpened the tension. "They will come again," Lark whispered, voice barely audible over the wind. "I'm not sure if we can stop them." Kaelen's jaw tightened, eyes narrowing. "We will see," he said. "But tonight you have earned a place by my fire. Rest. The desert is unforgiving, and you cannot fight it alone." Lark allowed herself to sink to the ground beside the fire, her bruised body trembling. Sparks danced over Kaelen's shoulders as he settled nearby, watchful and silent, a living sentinel in the twilight. For the first time since the day had begun, she felt something she hadn't dared to hope for, a fragile sense of protection, and the understanding that the warrior beside her was not only fierce, but bound by a code she was only beginning to comprehend. The wind moaned through the mesas, carrying dust, whispers, and distant threats, but around the fire, Lark Winthrop felt the smallest seed of safety. And she knew that the night and the challenges to come would test both her courage and the resolve of the man who had already begun to shock her world with his presence. The night had swallowed the mesa, leaving only the firelight flickering against Kaelen's broad, tanned shoulders. Lark Winthrop stumbled beside him, exhaustion weighing her down like stones tied to her feet. Her bruised arms throbbed, her ribs screamed with every breath, and the sting of the desert wind cut through her thin dress. But still, she led the way toward the homestead, each step a quiet testament to the fear and the determination that burned inside her. Kaelen followed silently, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon, muscles tense beneath his bare torso. The beads and feathers in his hair clinked softly with each careful step, a counterpoint to the harsh crunch of sand and gravel underfoot. His gaze flicked to Lark now and then, noting the tremor in her hands, the slump of her shoulders, the way she forced herself to keep moving despite pain and fear. He had faced danger countless times, yet there was something uniquely fragile about her courage that impressed him. When they reached the homestead, the sight that greeted them made Lark falter. Broken fence posts leaned crookedly into the desert dust. The door hung from a single hinge, splintered and battered. Inside, floorboards were cracked and dark stains blood she feared marred the wooden planks. Her knees gave way and she sank to the ground, hands clutching at the earth. They didn't care, she whispered, voice raw. "I've seen it before. But I thought maybe—" Her words trailed off into the desert wind. Kaelen knelt beside her without hesitation, one hand brushing hers in a gesture that was both gentle and commanding. "You thought wrong," he said softly, his voice low, steady like a calm river beneath a storm. "But you survived. That is what matters now." Lark lifted her gaze to him, meeting his dark eyes. In the firelight, they seemed to contain a universe of past battles, losses, and hard-won wisdom. She had expected fury, perhaps retribution. Instead, she found a quiet, calculating presence that measured every detail, every nuance, yet offered protection. The contrast left her breathless. "We can't." "They might return," she said, pointing toward the distant hills where shadows hinted at movement. Her voice trembled as fear pressed back into her chest. "I don't know if anyone else is left to help us." Kaelen's jaw tightened, and his eyes scanned the horizon, reading every contour, every shadow. "They will return," he said finally. "But not tonight. Tonight, we prepare." "And you?" He reached out, lifting her chin gently. "You survive because you have courage, and courage is not given freely. It is earned, and you have earned it." The wind picked up again, tossing dust into their faces, carrying the scent of sage, blood, and dry earth. Lark shivered, more from awe than cold. Kaelen rose, towering over her like a sentinel carved from the desert itself. He lifted a large branch from the ground and began reinforcing the broken fence posts, each movement precise and controlled, a dance of power and purpose. Lark watched, realizing that this man's hands could destroy or protect with equal skill, and that, tonight, they were protecting her. Finally, Kaelen stepped back, surveying his work. "It will hold for now," he said, "but we must remain vigilant." He looked at Lark, eyes softening, and for the first time she noticed a flicker of emotion beneath the warrior's hard exterior, a hint of respect, maybe even understanding. Lark's hands itched to help, to do something, anything, to prove herself, but her body refused. Instead, she settled on the ground near the fire, feeling the heat brush her chilled skin. Sparks danced in the night air, settling on Kaelen's broad shoulders, highlighting the intricate jewelry woven into his hair and the scars etched across his torso. She realized with a mixture of fear and awe that this man, this warrior, was a force of nature, both terrifying and protective, and somehow, inexplicably, he had chosen to stand by her. "Thank you," she whispered finally, voice barely audible, "for staying." Kaelen's gaze softened slightly, though his posture remained alert, ready for any threat. "Do not thank me yet," he said. "Survival is earned with each moment, and this night is far from over. But for now, rest. You need strength, Lark Winthrop, for what comes next." The fire crackled between them, casting long, shifting shadows over broken wood and desert dust. Outside, the wind howled through the mesas, carrying the faint scent of distant threats. Inside, a fragile, uneasy trust began to grow between the settler woman and the Apache warrior. A bond forged in fear, courage, and the unforgiving heart of the Old West. For Lark, the realization came slowly. The desert had spared her that night, not by chance, but by the presence of the man who had already begun to change everything she thought she knew about survival, honor, and courage. The desert night was heavy with silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the occasional whisper of wind over the mesas. Lark Winthrop sat huddled near the small campfire, her bruised ribs aching with every shallow breath. Kaelen stood a few paces away, muscles taut beneath his bare, tan torso, his long black hair falling over his shoulders, feathers and beads clinking faintly with each subtle movement. His eyes, dark and calculating, scanned the horizon like a hawk, alert to every sound, every shadow. "They're coming," he said, voice low, more statement than question. Lark's pulse quickened, and she jumped to her feet despite the ache that ran through her body. The distant thump of hooves began to reach her ears, faint at first, then steadily growing, like a drumbeat heralding a storm. She turned to see the silhouettes of horses against the horizon, dusty shapes moving fast, riding with purpose. Kaelen's jaw tightened. "Mount up," he commanded. He swung onto his horse with fluid precision, a powerful silhouette against the setting moon. Lark hesitated, but he held out a hand. "You must ride with me, now." Her trembling hands grasped the saddle horn as he lifted her gently behind him. The warmth of his body, the solid weight of his arms around her, was both terrifying and strangely reassuring. The settlers emerged from the darkness, their shapes more distinct now, weapons glinting faintly in the moonlight. They had come seeking revenge, driven by anger and fear, their faces twisted with hatred. Lark's stomach churned, fear and awe warring inside her. Kaelen's horse pawed the ground, nostrils flaring, muscles coiled like springs. The warrior's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Lark saw a storm contained within him, a force ready to unleash devastation if provoked. "Hold on tight," he said, his voice steady as a rock in the rising wind. Dust swirled around them, stinging their eyes, carrying the smell of dry earth and horse sweat. The mesa trembled beneath the thunder of hooves, the settlers charging forward with wild determination. Lark's heart pounded so loudly she feared he would hear it over the approaching chaos. Kaelen rode with the precision of a predator, positioning himself between Lark and the attackers. His movements were calculated, fluid, each motion a combination of strength and instinct. He did not strike immediately, but made his presence known, towering, unflinching, a living wall of power and authority. The settlers hesitated, uncertainty flickering across their faces as the firelight danced across his scarred, muscular torso, the beads and feathers in his hair shining like tiny flames. "You will not touch her," Kaelen said, his voice a low rumble that carried across the plain. "Turn back now, or you will regret it." A tense silence followed, broken only by the wind and the stamping of restless horses. Lark clutched the saddle horn, her knuckles white, every nerve in her body alight with fear and anticipation. For the first time, she saw the full measure of the man she had helped, the warrior who could command life and death with nothing more than a glance. The settlers hesitated, some lowering their weapons slightly, others exchanging uncertain looks. Kaelen did not move, but the energy radiating from him was palpable, like a coiled spring ready to strike. He was not a man to be trifled with, and the desert seemed to lean into his presence, amplifying the aura of danger. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the settlers slowly began to retreat, their horses kicking up clouds of dust as they disappeared into the darkness. Kaelen's gaze followed them, unblinking, until they vanished completely. Only then did he turn to Lark, letting out a slow, measured breath. "You are safe. For now," he said. His eyes softened, but the tension in his body remained, ready for whatever threat might come next. Lark slid off the horse, trembling, her knees weak, and sank to the ground near the fire. Sparks danced across Kaelen's shoulders, highlighting his scars and the intricate jewelry that adorned him, a reminder of both his heritage and the battles he had endured. Lark lifted her gaze to him, her voice barely audible. "Thank you for saving me." Kaelen's lips pressed into a thin line, and he shook his head. "It is not thanks I seek, Lark Winthrop. It is survival. Remember this. The desert does not forgive weakness, and those who would harm you do not rest easily. We must remain vigilant." The wind moaned through the mesas, carrying with it the scent of sagebrush, dust, and distant danger. Lark realized with a mixture of fear and awe that the night was far from over, but she had survived the first storm. And she knew, with a fragile certainty, that Kaelen, the Apache warrior who had appeared at the firelight like a force of nature, would be by her side through whatever came next. The fire crackled, sending sparks into the cold desert night, their brief glow dancing across Kaelen's broad, tanned shoulders. Lark Winthrop sat close, her bruised arms hugging her knees, the heat of the flames brushing her chilled skin. The mesa lay quiet now, save for the distant rustle of sagebrush and the occasional coyote's mournful howl. The settlers had retreated for now, but the tension that hung in the air was thick. Like the dust that clung to their clothes and hair, Kaelen leaned against a rock, knife in hand, not sharpening it, but resting on its edge as his dark eyes scanned the horizon. His long black hair fell over his shoulders, feathers and beads clinking softly with every small movement. He had not spoken since the last confrontation, yet the air between them was alive with unspoken communication, vigilance, respect, and a subtle recognition of shared struggle. "You're quiet," Lark said, breaking the silence. Her voice was low, almost a whisper. "Do you ever rest?" Kaelen's eyes flicked to her, catching the glow of the fire in her tear-streaked face. He gave a small, almost imperceptible shrug. "Rest is a luxury," he said, voice deep and measured. "For some, it is survival itself that counts as rest. The desert does not forgive weakness, Lark Winthrop." She shivered, not from the cold, but from the weight of his words. I suppose that makes me weak then, she murmured, trying to hide the tremor in her voice. I can barely lift my arms without pain. Kaelen's gaze softened, and for a moment, the fierce warrior seemed almost human, a man shaped by loss and honor, capable of empathy. Weakness is not the absence of pain, he said, his tone deliberate. Weakness is refusing to face it. You have faced it today, and you endure. That is strength. Lark's chest rose and fell rapidly. His words were strange, comforting, and yet alien. She had spent her life being dismissed, told she was fragile or foolish. And now, beside this man shaped by the desert itself, she felt seen in a way she had never known. Tell me about your people, she said softly, curiosity breaking through her exhaustion. The firelight reflected in her eyes, highlighting the dark rings beneath them, the traces of blood and dust on her skin. The Apache. What is it like, your life out here? Kaelen leaned back on his hands, gazing into the fire. Sparks spiraled upward, carried by the gentle desert wind. Our life is a balance, he said slowly. Between the land and the storms, between survival and honor, between family and the endless encroachment of outsiders who do not understand. We fight, we endure, and we protect what is ours. His eyes flicked to Lark, sharp and assessing. Protection is not given lightly. Lark nodded, understanding more than she could explain. And yet, you protected me, she whispered, even when you did not have to. Kaelen's lips pressed into a thin line, and for a long moment he said nothing. Then, finally, he spoke. You risked yourself for me first. That is not forgotten. We honor those who show courage, even when it is inconvenient, even when it is dangerous. You have shown that courage tonight. The wind stirred again, carrying the scent of sage, dust, and distant threats. Lark drew her knees closer, letting herself breathe in the warmth of the fire and the presence of the man beside her. There was something primal about him, something that spoke of mountains, rivers, and endless plains, the heart of the land itself, strong and untamed, yet capable of loyalty and mercy. I'm not sure I deserve your trust, she admitted, voice barely audible. I've lived among people who would rather see me hurt than survive. Kaelen studied her, eyes narrowing thoughtfully. Trust is not given freely, Lark Winthrop. It is earned. And tonight, you have earned it. But the desert does not forgive mistakes. You must remember that. Lark allowed herself a small, tentative smile. For the first time in days, perhaps in years, she felt the smallest spark of hope. Maybe she was not entirely alone. Maybe, against the unforgiving desert and the cruelty of some men, there were still moments of understanding, of quiet protection, of firelight and shared survival. Kaelen leaned back, resting one arm on his knee, and the firelight flickered across his scarred, muscular torso. In that glow, Lark saw not just a warrior, but a man shaped by hardship and honor, capable of both ferocity and mercy. She realized that the night had become something more than fear, it had become a fragile pact. A silent acknowledgement that they would face whatever came next together. Outside the small circle of firelight, the desert stretched vast and unyielding. But inside, beside the Apache warrior, Lark Winthrop felt for the first time a sense of fragile safety and the knowledge that courage, hers and his, would guide them through the trials yet to come. The first light of dawn barely touched the horizon, painting the desert in muted shades of gray and gold. Lark Winthrop shivered, huddled beside the dying embers of the fire, her bruised body aching from the previous day's ordeal. Kaelen stood near the edge of the mesa, muscles taut beneath his bare, tan torso. Long black hair falling over his shoulders, feathers and beads swaying lightly with each movement. His eyes, dark and alert, scanned the desert floor with a predator's precision. Something's coming, he muttered. barely above a whisper. Lark's stomach clenched. The settlers had retreated last night, but Kaelen's instincts were never wrong. He crouched low, hands resting on the hilt of his knife, eyes narrowing at subtle movements in the sand and distant rocks. Even the birds seemed to sense the tension, their calls fading into an uneasy silence. Lark's voice trembled. "Do you think they've come back for us?" Kaelen's gaze did not waver. "Yes, and they will not leave quietly." He gestured for her to mount her horse, positioning himself in front of her. Lark hesitated, fear making her knees weak, but the warmth and strength radiating from Kaelen reassured her. She clutched the saddle horn tightly as he lifted her gently behind him. The beat of her heart thundered louder than the wind, but Kaelen's steady grip held her, a living shield against the unknown danger approaching in the distance. The faint sound of hooves reached their ears, a drumbeat that grew steadily, faster, and heavier. The settlers were returning, their intentions clear in the sharp glint of metal and the shapes of weapons held high. The desert dust swirled around them, kicked up by the advancing horses, painting the air in golden-brown haze that stung Lark's eyes. Kaelen's jaw tightened, muscles rippling beneath his scarred torso as he spurred his horse forward. "Hold on," he commanded, voice low and firm. His presence was a force of nature, a storm contained within human form, ready to strike. The ground seemed to tremble beneath the hooves as the settlers charged, their shouts harsh and cruel against the quiet of the morning desert. Lark clutched the saddle tightly, leaning close to Kaelen, trying to absorb the confidence radiating from him. He rode with precision, maneuvering them between rocks and uneven terrain, placing himself as a living barrier between her and the threat. The Apache warriors' movements were fluid and calculated, a mixture of instinct, experience, and raw power. Dust swirled around them, stinging their skin and filling their lungs. But Kaelen remained unshaken, every motion designed to protect, every glance sharp with awareness. The settlers hesitated as they approached, confusion flashing across their faces. Kaelen stopped, planting his horse firmly, his bare torso glinting with sweat and the firelight that lingered from last night. He did not strike, yet the sheer aura of authority and danger radiating from him made the attackers falter. Lark's pulse raced, adrenaline mixing with awe as she realized the magnitude of the man behind her. He was not just a warrior, he was a force the desert itself seemed to respect. "You will not harm her," Kaelen said, voice low but carrying over the mesa. "Turn back now." For a moment, the settlers wavered, uncertainty replacing their anger. Kaelen's eyes, dark and unyielding, bore into them like a living warning. The wind carried the scent of sagebrush, dust, and the tang of sweat and fear. Lark's breath caught in her throat. The power, control, and measured threat radiating from him were more frightening than any weapon. Finally, one by one, the settlers turned their horses, retreating into the rising sun and the swirling dust. Kaelen remained still, watching until the last shadow disappeared beyond the mesa. Only then did he turn to Lark, voice softening slightly. "You are safe. For now. But the desert does not forgive mistakes. Never forget that." Lark slid off the horse, knees trembling, and sank near the remaining embers of the fire. Sparks danced upward, reflecting across Kaelen's scarred, muscular torso and the intricate tribal jewelry woven into his hair. She realized with a mixture of fear and awe that the man before her was not only a warrior but a protector shaped by the land, bound by honor and instinct. "I thought I might die," she whispered, voice shaking. Kaelen shook his head slowly. "Death comes to all, Lark Winthrop. But courage and the choices we make determine what survives." His dark eyes softened as he added, almost reluctantly, "You have courage. Remember that." Outside the small circle of firelight, the desert stretched endlessly, vast and unyielding. Inside, a fragile bond had grown stronger, built on trust, shared fear, and survival. And Lark knew, as she looked at the towering, bare-chested Apache warrior beside her, that whatever came next in the unforgiving desert, they would face it together. The desert sun burned pale gold across the horizon, illuminating the jagged mesas and the dusty plain below. Lark Winthrop's knees ached from hours on horseback, yet she pressed on, her hands gripping the saddle horn tightly. Kaelen rode beside her, muscles rippling beneath his bare, tan torso, long black hair falling over his shoulders, feathers and beads swaying with each movement. His dark eyes scanned the horizon with the precision of a predator, every sense alert to danger. "They've returned," Lark whispered, her voice trembling. In the distance, the dust clouds of horse hooves and the glint of weapons marked the settlers' advance. Her stomach clenched with fear, but Kaelen's presence steadied her, a solid force against the storm of chaos that approached. Kaelen slowed his horse, positioning Lark slightly behind him. "Stay close," he said, voice low but firm. "This ends now." His tone carried the authority of a man who had faced countless battles and survived, and Lark felt a strange mixture of fear and trust. She had seen his strength, his skill, and his unwavering resolve, and she knew that with him she stood a chance against the danger ahead. The settlers' shouts grew louder as they neared, their anger raw, their intentions unmistakable. Kaelen spurred his horse forward, riding directly toward the first wave, his bare chest glistening with sweat, the fire of determination in his dark eyes. Sparks of sunlight caught the beads and feathers in his hair, making him appear larger than life, a living storm on horseback. Lark held on tightly, heart pounding in rhythm with the thundering hooves around them. Kaelen stopped at the edge of the plain, planting his horse firmly, muscles coiled like springs. The settlers hesitated, momentarily caught off guard by the sheer presence of the Apache warrior, the authority and danger radiating from his tall, scarred form. Lark could feel the tension in the air, a knife-edge silence broken only by the pounding of hooves and the desert wind. "You will harm no one," Kaelen called out, voice booming across the plain. "Turn back or face what you cannot withstand." The settlers wavered, uncertainty flashing across their faces. Some lowered their weapons slightly, others exchanged uneasy glances. Lark's pulse raced as she watched Kaelen, awe mixing with terror. He did not need to strike. His stance, his gaze, his very presence was enough to command obedience. Finally, the settlers faltered, then turned, retreating into the swirling dust and heat of the morning desert. Kaelen's eyes never left them until the last rider disappeared over the distant ridge. Only then did he turn to Lark, a faint softening in his gaze. "You are safe," he said, voice calm but firm. "For now. But the desert does not forgive carelessness. Remember that, Lark Winthrop." Lark slid off her horse, knees weak, and sank near the edge of the plain, dust clinging to her skin, bruises throbbing, yet a small smile tugged at her lips. Sparks from the small fire nearby danced in the morning light, glinting across Kaelen's scarred, muscular torso and the intricate tribal jewelry in his hair. She realized in that moment that the warrior beside her was more than a protector. He was a living force of the land, shaped by hardship, honor, and survival. I never imagined I'd see morning like this," she whispered, voice trembling but filled with awe. "Not after everything." Kaelen's lips pressed into a thin line. "Morning comes to those who endure," he said softly. "And you endured. That is what matters. Courage is measured not by the battles you fight, but by the strength to face each day knowing danger waits." Lark nodded, her chest heaving. I owe you everything," she admitted, voice barely audible. "For saving me, for standing by me." Kaelen studied her for a long moment, then gave a small nod. "Do not mistake protection for ownership," he said. We survived together, not because of one, but because of both. You have your courage. I have my strength. Together, we endure. The desert stretched endlessly around them, harsh, vast, and unforgiving. Yet in the quiet aftermath of the battle, beneath the morning sun, a fragile sense of peace settled over Lark and Kaelen. They had faced danger, survived the night, and found in each other an unspoken bond, one forged in fear, bravery. And the relentless heart of the Old West died as the wind whispered across the mesas, carrying the scent of sage and dust. Lark Winthrop realized that the trials were far from over, but she would face them, not alone and not in fear. By her side, the Apache warrior remained, a steadfast guardian, a force of the desert itself, and the promise of survival and courage burned bright between them.